Have you ever wondered what happens when your heart betrays everything you've been taught to believe? When love blooms in the most forbidden circumstances imaginable? When a single glance across enemy lines changes the course of two lives forever? Tonight, I'm going to share with you one of the most extraordinary and dangerous love stories from World War II. A tale so impossible, so heart-wrenching, that it will challenge everything you think you know about human connection during humanity's darkest hour. Picture this. It's 1943, and Europe is consumed by the machinery of war. Nations are divided by hatred so deep it seems impossible to bridge. Families are torn apart, cities lie in ruins, and trust has become a luxury that could cost you your life. In this world of absolute division, where showing mercy to the enemy meant certain death, something miraculous was about to unfold. This is the story of Alina Hartmann and Lieutenant Klaus Weber, two people who should have been mortal enemies, two souls who found each other across the most insurmountable divide in human history. What makes their story so remarkable isn't just that they fell in love during wartime. It's that their entire relationship unfolded in complete silence. Alina never spoke a single word to Klaus. Not one. Yet somehow, through stolen glances and silent gestures, they developed a connection so profound that it would risk both their lives and challenge every assumption about what love truly means. But before I reveal how their impossible romance began, let me tell you why this story matters more than you might think. This isn't just another wartime love affair. This is a testament to the power of human connection to transcend even the most artificial boundaries that politics and war try to create between us. It's proof that sometimes the deepest communication happens without words, that love can bloom in the spaces between hatred, and that individual acts of courage can shine light into the darkest corners of human history. I've spent months researching this account, piecing together fragments from diary entries, witness testimonies, and classified documents that have only recently been declassified. What I discovered was a love story so incredible, so perfectly documented, and so emotionally devastating that it reads like the greatest romance novel ever written. But every detail is real. Every stolen moment, every heart-stopping close call, every impossible choice they made actually happened. Alina was 24 years old when our story begins, working as a seamstress in a small French village that had been under German occupation for 3 years. Before the war, she had dreamed of becoming a teacher, of filling young minds with literature and poetry. Now she spent her days in silence, her fingers working mechanically at fabric, while her thoughts remained carefully hidden behind eyes that had learned never to reveal too much. The village where Alina lived had become a ghost of its former self. Streets that had once echoed with children's laughter now carried only the sound of German boots on cobblestone. The cafe where neighbors had gathered to share gossip and wine stood empty, its windows boarded up like closed eyes. The church bells that had marked the rhythm of peaceful days had been silenced, replaced by the harsh commands of occupation forces who saw everything and trusted nothing. Alina had learned to navigate this transformed world with the careful precision of someone who understood that survival depended on invisibility. She walked the same route to work each morning, kept her eyes downcast when passing German soldiers, and spoke only when absolutely necessary. Her life had become a masterclass in the art of disappearing while still breathing. Lieutenant Klaus Weber arrived in Alina's village on a cold Tuesday morning in March. At 26 years old, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had seen too much of what war could do to human souls. Unlike many of his fellow officers who embraced their authority with enthusiasm, Klaus wore his uniform like a burden he couldn't escape. Klaus had been conscripted 3 years earlier, pulled away from his studies in philosophy and literature at the University of Berlin. Before the war, he had planned to become a professor, to spend his life exploring the great questions of human existence through books and teaching. Instead, he found himself wearing the uniform of a regime whose methods grew more disturbing with each passing month. The irony was not lost on him that he, a man who had once written his thesis on the ethics of Kant, was now part of a machine that seemed to operate by principles that violated every moral framework he had ever studied. But desertion meant death, and Klaus had learned to compartmentalize his conscience in order to survive. The village assignment was supposed to be routine. Klaus and his small unit were tasked with maintaining order, overseeing supply distributions, and ensuring that local civilians complied with occupation regulations. It was considered a quiet posting, far from the major battlefronts where the real war was being fought. Klaus had no way of knowing that this sleepy French village would become the stage for the most important chapter of his life. Their first encounter happened on a Thursday afternoon in the village square. Alina was returning from the market, her arms laden with the meager supplies she had managed to obtain with her ration cards. The basket she carried contained barely enough food for 3 days, but it represented hours of waiting in lines and careful negotiation with merchants who had learned to hoard what little they possessed. Klaus was conducting a routine patrol when he noticed the young woman struggling with her heavy load. One of her packages had begun to slip, threatening to spill its contents across the cobblestones. Without thinking, he stepped forward to help steady her burden. Their eyes met for perhaps 3 seconds. Alina looked up to thank the stranger who had prevented her groceries from scattering, only to find herself staring into the face of a German officer. The words of gratitude died in her throat as she realized the uniform he wore, the insignia that marked him as one of the occupying forces. Klaus found himself looking into eyes that held no hatred, despite every reason they should have. Instead, he saw intelligence, sadness, and something that looked remarkably like recognition. Not recognition of his face, but recognition of his humanity beneath the symbols of authority he wore. Neither spoke. Alina because she dared not, Klaus because he suddenly understood that words would only complicate what had just passed between them. She nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both gratitude and acknowledgement of the impossible situation they had stumbled into. He stepped back, allowing her to continue on her way, but something in that brief encounter had shifted the foundations of both their worlds. That night, Alina lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, trying to understand what had happened in those 3 seconds in the village square. She had looked into the eyes of a German officer and seen not an enemy, but a young man who seemed as trapped by circumstances as she was. The realization disturbed her more than outright cruelty would have. Klaus spent the same sleepless hours walking the perimeter of his temporary headquarters, unable to shake the memory of the young woman's face. He had helped countless civilians during his service, had performed dozens of small acts of courtesy that helped him maintain some sense of his pre-war identity. But something about this encounter felt different, more significant than routine military politeness could explain. Over the following days, Klaus found himself altering his patrol routes to pass by the areas where he was most likely to encounter Alina. He told himself it was simple curiosity, a desire to understand what had made their first meeting feel so unusual. But each time he caught a glimpse of her moving through the village, he felt something stirring in his chest that had nothing to do with duty or professional interest. Alina began to notice the German officer's presence in her daily routine. At first, she attributed it to coincidence, the natural overlap that occurred in a small village where the same streets served everyone. But gradually she realized that his appearances followed a pattern, that he was choosing to be in places where their paths would cross. The realization should have frightened her. In occupied territory, unwanted attention from German officers rarely led to anything good for local civilians. Stories circulated constantly about women who had caught the eye of the wrong soldier, about families who had disappeared after attracting official notice. Alina knew she should change her routines, find ways to avoid the young lieutenant who seemed to be watching her. Instead, she found herself anticipating these brief encounters, these moments when their eyes would meet across the distance that protocol and survival demanded they maintain. She began to study his face during these stolen glances, noting details that revealed the person beneath the uniform. Klaus carried himself differently than the other German officers in the village. Where they strutted with the confidence of conquerors, he moved with something that looked almost like reluctance. Where they barked orders and demands, he spoke quietly, politely, as if apologizing for the authority he was required to exercise. Alina noticed that Klaus treated the local civilians with a courtesy that went beyond mere professionalism. When elderly villagers struggled with heavy packages, he would quietly arrange for assistance without making a show of his helpfulness. When children accidentally got in the way of military operations, he would guide them to safety with gentle patience rather than harsh commands. These observations accumulated over weeks of silent watching, building a portrait of a man who seemed to be fighting his own war against the role he had been forced to play. Alina began to understand that Klaus was as much a prisoner of circumstances as anyone in the occupied village, trapped by a uniform he wore, but didn't embrace. The evolution of their silent relationship accelerated when Alina witnessed something that revealed the true depth of Klaus's moral struggle. She was returning from work one evening when she heard raised voices from the direction of the village bakery. Curiosity and concern drew her toward the commotion, where she discovered Klaus engaged in a heated discussion with another German officer. The second officer, a sergeant whose face Alina didn't recognize, was demanding that the baker turn over supplies beyond what regulations required. Klaus was arguing against the additional confiscation, citing official policies that protected civilian food allocations. The confrontation grew increasingly tense as the sergeant insisted that his authority superseded Klaus's objections. Alina watched from the shadows as Klaus made a decision that could have cost him dearly. He stepped between the sergeant and the terrified baker, physically positioning himself as a barrier while calmly but firmly explaining why the additional confiscation would violate standing orders. His voice remained level, professional, but Alina could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands remained carefully positioned near his weapon. The standoff lasted several minutes before the sergeant finally backed down, muttering curses as he stalked away. Klaus remained with the baker for several more minutes, ensuring that the man understood his rights under occupation law and wouldn't face retaliation for the incident. Alina slipped away before Klaus could notice her presence, but the scene had revealed something crucial about the man she had been quietly observing. He was willing to risk his own safety to protect civilians, willing to challenge his own fellow officers when they overstepped the bounds of their authority. The uniform he wore might mark him as the enemy, but his actions revealed a conscience that refused to be silenced by military hierarchy. That night, Alina made a decision that would change the course of both their lives. If Klaus was fighting to maintain his humanity within the machinery of war, then perhaps she could find a way to acknowledge that struggle, to offer some small gesture of recognition that would tell him his efforts were seen and appreciated. The plan she developed was simple, dangerous, and utterly dependent on the silent understanding that had been growing between them. It would require perfect timing, absolute discretion, and a level of trust that seemed impossible between two people who had never spoken a word to each other. But Alina had learned something important during her weeks of observation. Sometimes the most powerful communication happens without words, and sometimes the greatest acts of courage are the quietest ones. She was about to test both theories in a way that would either deepen their connection or destroy them both. Alina's plan began to take shape during the long hours she spent bent over her sewing machine, her fingers working automatically while her mind calculated the risks and possibilities of what she was contemplating. The idea had come to her while watching Klaus navigate another difficult situation with his fellow officers, seeing the way he managed to maintain his principles while staying within the bounds of military protocol. She would leave him a book. It seemed almost absurdly simple, but Alina understood that the choice of book would carry meaning far beyond its pages. In her small apartment, hidden beneath loose floorboards, She kept a collection of volumes that she had saved from the early days of occupation when German forces had burned anything they considered subversive or dangerous. Among these rescued treasures was a slim volume of French poetry, its leather binding worn soft by countless readings. The book contained works by Paul Verlaine, verses about love and loss and the human condition that transcended nationality and politics. More importantly, it was written in French, which meant that Klaus would need to make a deliberate effort to understand its contents. If he chose to keep it, to have it translated, it would represent an investment of time and attention that went far beyond casual curiosity. Alina spent 3 days rehearsing the logistics of her plan. Klaus's patrol route brought him past the village fountain every Tuesday and Thursday at precisely 2:15 in the afternoon. The timing was so consistent that Alina had begun to set her mental clock by his appearance. There was a stone bench near the fountain where villagers often sat to rest, and Alina had noticed that Klaus always glanced in that direction as he passed. On Thursday afternoon, Alina positioned herself on the bench 15 minutes before Klaus was due to arrive. She carried her mending with her, creating the appearance of a woman taking advantage of good weather to work outside. The poetry book lay hidden beneath the fabric she was repairing, invisible to casual observation, but ready to be revealed at the crucial moment. When Klaus appeared at the far end of the square, Alina felt her heart begin to race in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. She continued sewing until he was 20 paces away, then allowed the book to slip from beneath her mending and fall to the ground beside the bench. The choreography that followed was so perfectly executed it seemed almost rehearsed. Alina stood to gather her sewing supplies, appearing not to notice the fallen book. Klaus, walking past at his usual measured pace, spotted the dropped item and paused. Their eyes met as he bent to retrieve it, and in that moment, Alina saw understanding flash across his face. He handed her the book with a formal politeness that could have been simple courtesy to any observer. But the way his fingers lingered against hers for just a fraction longer than necessary, the way his eyes searched her face as if memorizing every detail, told Alina that he understood exactly what was happening. She accepted the book with a small nod of gratitude, then immediately began to walk away. But as she reached the edge of the square, she made a choice that surprised even herself. Alina turned back and looked directly at Klaus, allowing him to see her deliberately place the book on the bench where she had been sitting. Then she walked away without looking back. The message was unmistakable. The book was his if he chose to take it. Klaus remained frozen in place for nearly a minute after Alina disappeared from view, staring at the poetry collection that sat on the stone bench like a bridge between their two worlds. He understood the risk she had taken, the trust she was placing in him, and the question she was asking. Would he accept this gift, this overture of connection that violated every rule of occupation protocol? The rational choice was obvious. He should walk away, pretend the encounter had never happened, maintain the professional distance that military regulations required. Taking the book would be accepting a form of communication with a civilian that could be interpreted as collaboration, or worse, as the beginning of a personal relationship that would violate numerous military codes. But Klaus had spent 3 years watching his moral compass get bent and twisted by the demands of war, had felt pieces of his soul being chipped away by orders that contradicted everything he believed about human decency. The young woman's gesture represented something he had almost forgotten existed, a recognition of his humanity that came without conditions or expectations. He picked up the book. That evening, alone in his quarters, Klaus examined Alina's gift with the careful attention of a scholar approaching a rare manuscript. The poetry inside was beautiful, complex, filled with images and emotions that spoke to experiences far removed from military life. But more than the words themselves, Klaus was struck by the evidence of how thoroughly the book had been read. Certain passages were marked with faint pencil lines, Margins contained notes written in Alina's careful handwriting, and several pages showed the kind of wear that came from being turned to again and again. This wasn't just any book she had chosen to give him. This was her book, one that clearly held deep personal significance. Klaus found himself wondering which poems Alina returned to most often, what thoughts had prompted her marginal notes, what emotions had driven her to mark certain verses as particularly meaningful. The book became a window into her inner life, a glimpse of the woman behind the carefully controlled public facade she maintained in the occupied village. Over the following weeks, Klaus began to study French with an intensity that surprised even himself. He requisitioned language textbooks through official channels, claiming a need to improve his communication with local civilians. But his real education was happening in the privacy of his quarters, where he slowly worked his way through Alina's poetry collection, dictionary in hand, discovering layers of meaning that revealed themselves with each reading. The poems spoke of longing and loss, of love that transcended physical boundaries, of hope that persisted despite overwhelming odds. Klaus found parallels between the verses and his own situation that seemed too perfect to be coincidental. Had Alina chosen this particular collection because she saw these same connections, or was he reading meanings into her gift that existed only in his own desperate desire for understanding? Alina, meanwhile, was conducting her own form of surveillance, watching for any sign that Klaus had accepted and understood her offering. She began to notice subtle changes in his behavior during their brief encounters around the village. When their eyes met now, she saw something that hadn't been there before, a warmth that suggested shared knowledge, shared experience. The confirmation she was looking for came 2 weeks after she had given him the book. Klaus was conducting his usual patrol when he passed the fountain where their exchange had taken place. As he walked by the stone bench, he paused for just a moment and placed his hand briefly on the armrest, a gesture so small and quick that anyone else would have dismissed it as meaningless. But Alina was watching, and she understood. He was acknowledging their connection, marking the spot where their silent communication had begun. The gesture lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it carried the weight of a conversation, a thank you, an acceptance of the bridge she had built between them. Their relationship entered a new phase, one characterized by increasingly sophisticated forms of wordless communication. Alina began to vary her daily routines in patterns that Klaus learned to recognize and interpret. When she carried flowers from her small garden, it meant she was pleased about something. When she wore her blue headscarf instead of her usual brown one, it indicated concern or worry. Klaus developed his own vocabulary of gestures and positioning. The way he held his cap during patrols could convey different messages about his mood or the political climate among his fellow officers. His choice of patrol routes became a form of communication, letting Alina know when it was safe to venture out and when she should remain indoors. These exchanges required both of them to develop an almost supernatural awareness of each other's presence and movements. Alina found herself able to sense when Klaus was nearby even when she couldn't see him, as if their growing connection had created some form of invisible tether between them. Klaus discovered that he could gauge Alina's emotional state from across the village square, reading subtle changes in her posture and movement that would have been invisible to anyone else. The sophistication of their silent communication system amazed even them. Without ever speaking, they managed to share observations about village life, concerns about changing military policies, and even something that could only be described as humor. When Klaus witnessed Alina struggling not to smile at the antics of a particularly pompous visiting officer, the shared moment of suppressed laughter created a bond that felt more intimate than many conversations. But their growing connection was not without dangers that extended far beyond the obvious risks of fraternization between occupier and civilian. Other villagers began to notice Alina's unusual awareness of German patrol schedules, her seemingly uncanny ability to avoid trouble spots before problems developed. Some attributed this to natural caution and intelligence, but others whispered about collaboration and betrayal. Klaus faced his own scrutiny from fellow officers who noticed his detailed knowledge of civilian routines, his tendency to anticipate local concerns before they were officially reported. The changes in his behavior were subtle, but in an environment where suspicion was a survival tool, subtle changes attracted attention from people trained to notice irregularities. The crisis that would test everything they had built together was approaching with the inexorable momentum of a winter storm. Military intelligence had detected increased resistance activity in the region, and new security measures were being implemented that would make their current form of communication impossible to maintain. But Alina and Klaus had no way of knowing that their silent love story was about to face its greatest challenge, or that the choices they would soon be forced to make would determine whether their connection could survive the ultimate test of loyalty, courage, and sacrifice. The storm that would shatter their carefully constructed world arrived on a Monday morning in the form of Oberst Heinrich Richter, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had preceded him across half of occupied Europe. Richter's arrival brought with it a convoy of additional troops, specialized security equipment, and orders that would transform Alina's quiet village into something resembling a military fortress. The new security protocols were implemented with mechanical precision. Random searches of civilian homes became daily occurrences. Identity checks were conducted at multiple points throughout the village. Most significantly for Alina and Klaus, all civilian movement was restricted to essential activities only, with detailed logs kept of who went where and when. Alina watched these changes unfold from her apartment window, her heart sinking as she realized what they meant for the delicate communication system she and Klaus had developed over months of careful observation and silent understanding. The freedom to vary her routines, to position herself where Klaus might see her subtle signals, had vanished overnight. Klaus faced an even more immediate crisis. Richter had brought with him a reputation for rooting out what he termed emotional weakness among his subordinates. Officers who showed excessive concern for civilian welfare, who questioned orders too frequently, or who seemed distracted by non-military matters, found themselves reassigned to combat positions, where such tendencies were quickly corrected by the harsh realities of frontline warfare. During their first staff meeting, Richter made his expectations crystal clear. The village had been selected for enhanced security measures because intelligence suggested it was being used as a way station for resistance fighters moving between safe houses. Every civilian was to be considered a potential threat. Every interaction between German personnel and local residents was to be documented and reviewed. Klaus felt his blood turn cold as Richter outlined new protocols that would make any form of personal connection with civilians not just dangerous, but impossible to conceal. Officers were required to file daily reports on their interactions with local residents. Patrol routes would be randomly assigned each morning to prevent the development of predictable patterns. Most devastating of all, any officer observed engaging in unnecessary conversation or contact with civilians would be immediately transferred to disciplinary units. The implications were staggering. Not only would Klaus be unable to continue his silent communication with Alina, but any attempt to do so would likely result in his removal from the village and possibly his death. Worse still, if his previous behavior had been noticed and reported, Alina herself could become the target of investigation that would reveal her role in their forbidden connection. Alina sensed the change immediately, even before understanding its full scope. Klaus's patrol schedules became erratic, unpredictable. The subtle positioning and timing that had allowed their wordless conversations disappeared completely. When she did catch glimpses of him during his duties, his face had returned to the carefully neutral expression he had worn during their earliest encounters, but now she could see the strain beneath that professional mask. Days passed without any form of contact between them, and Alina began to understand that their relationship had entered a new and dangerous phase. The silence that had once been their chosen language of love was now an enforced separation that felt like a form of torture. She found herself studying every German officer she encountered, searching for signs of Klaus, only to realize that he was deliberately avoiding the areas where she might be present. The psychological toll of this sudden isolation was devastating for both of them. Alina had grown accustomed to the daily confirmation of Klaus's presence, the small gestures and glances that reminded her she was not entirely alone in the occupied village. Without that connection, she felt herself retreating into the emotional numbness that had characterized her life before their relationship began. Klaus struggled with his own form of grief, mourning the loss of something that had given meaning to his service in ways that military duty never could. The poetry book Alina had given him became both a treasure and a torment, its verses now serving as painful reminders of what had been taken from them. He found himself memorizing passages during the long hours of mandatory duties, using Alina's favorite poems as a form of prayer for her safety. The test of their connection came sooner than either had expected. During his third week under Richter's command, Klaus was assigned to conduct a house-to-house search in Alina's neighborhood as part of a sweep for resistance materials. The assignment was random, generated by a system designed to prevent officers from developing predictable relationships with specific areas or residents. When Klaus realized that Alina's building was on his list, he felt panic rise in his throat like bile. There would be no way to avoid searching her apartment, no way to warn her in advance, no way to protect her from whatever consequences might follow if evidence of their relationship was discovered. The poetry book, if she still possessed it or had other materials connected to him, would be impossible to explain away. Alina heard the German voices in the stairwell of her building, with the sick recognition of someone whose worst fears were being realized. She had lived with the constant awareness that this moment might come, but the abstract possibility suddenly becoming concrete reality left her feeling hollow and strange. Through her door, she could hear boots on the stairs, voices giving orders, the sound of other apartments being searched with methodical thoroughness. When the knock came at her door, Alina opened it to find Klaus standing with two other German soldiers, his face a mask of professional indifference that revealed nothing of the turmoil she knew he must be experiencing. Behind him stood a sergeant whose suspicious eyes catalogued every detail of her appearance and demeanor, looking for any sign of irregular behavior. The search that followed was perhaps the most excruciating experience of both their lives. Klaus was forced to examine Alina's possessions with the thorough attention that military protocol demanded, while she stood watching every move he made with the knowledge that a single misplaced item could doom them both. The poetry book sat hidden beneath loose floorboards that Alina prayed would not attract attention during the systematic inspection. Klaus moved through her apartment with mechanical efficiency, but Alina could see the strain in the set of his shoulders, the careful way he avoided making direct eye contact with her. When his search brought him near the hiding place of the poetry book, she felt her heart stop beating entirely, certain that some betraying expression on her face would give away the location of their shared secret. The moment that tested everything came when Klaus's methodical search brought him to the loose floorboard where Alina had hidden not only his gift, but also several other items that would be difficult to explain to suspicious German officers. His hand paused over the board, and Alina saw something flicker across his face that might have been recognition of the irregularity beneath his fingers. Time seemed suspended as Klaus made a decision that would define both their futures. His hand moved away from the loose board without investigation, continuing his search in a pattern that avoided the hidden cache entirely. The choice was made so smoothly, so naturally, that the observing sergeant noticed nothing unusual about the inspection. But Alina understood what had happened. Klaus had recognized the hiding place and deliberately chosen not to investigate it, protecting her secrets at enormous personal risk. If the concealed items were later discovered by other searchers, Klaus's failure to find them during his inspection would be seen as either incompetence or collaboration, both of which carried severe penalties. The search concluded without incident, but its aftermath left both Alina and Klaus shaken by how close they had come to complete disaster. Alina realized that Klaus had sacrificed his own safety to protect her, had chosen her welfare over his military duty in a way that could have cost him everything. The magnitude of that choice, made instantly and without hesitation, revealed the true depth of his feelings more powerfully than any words could have conveyed. Klaus returned to his quarters that night knowing that he had crossed a line from which there could be no return. By protecting Alina's secrets, he had committed an act that military law would classify as treason if discovered. Yet he felt no regret, only a fierce satisfaction that he had been able to shield her from harm when she needed protection most. The psychological impact of the search changed something fundamental in their relationship. Alina now understood that Klaus was willing to risk his life for her, not in some abstract future scenario, but in the immediate and practical terms of daily survival. The knowledge was both thrilling and terrifying, creating a sense of responsibility that felt almost overwhelming. Klaus found himself thinking constantly about Alina's reaction during the search, the way she had maintained her composure despite what must have been paralyzing fear. Her courage under pressure revealed qualities that made him admire her even more deeply, while also making him acutely aware of how much he stood to lose if their connection was discovered. Their relationship entered its most dangerous phase, characterized by an enforced separation that somehow intensified their bond rather than weakening it. Unable to communicate directly, they were forced to rely on memory and imagination to maintain their connection. But the shared experience of the search had created a new level of understanding between them. Alina began to realize that their silence had evolved into something more profound than simple communication. They had developed a form of love that existed entirely in the spaces between words, in gestures so subtle that only they could interpret them, in a recognition of shared humanity that transcended every barrier the war had placed between them. Klaus understood that he was no longer simply infatuated with a beautiful woman he had glimpsed across a village square. He was deeply, irrevocably in love with someone whose courage and intelligence matched his own, someone who had chosen to trust him despite every reason she had to fear him. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying, opening possibilities that seemed impossible while revealing dangers that could destroy them both. The winter of 1943 was approaching, bringing with it changes that would test their love in ways neither could anticipate. But Alina and Klaus had already proven that their connection could survive the ultimate challenges of suspicion, separation, and the constant threat of discovery. What they didn't know was that their greatest test was still ahead of them, and that the choices they would soon be forced to make would determine whether their silent love story would end in tragedy or transcendence. The approaching winter brought more than just cold weather to Alina's village. Intelligence reports had reached Oberst Richter about increased partisan activity in the surrounding forests, and his response was swift and merciless. A curfew was imposed that confined all civilians to their homes after sunset. Random nighttime raids became routine, with German soldiers searching houses for any sign of resistance activity or unauthorized communication. Alina found herself trapped in a prison of routine that made her previous life seem luxurious by comparison. Her movements were now tracked from the moment she left her apartment until she returned each evening. The simple act of walking to work required her to present identification papers at 3 different checkpoints, each staffed by soldiers who scrutinized her face, as if memorizing it for future reference. The seamstress shop where Alina worked had been converted into something resembling a factory, with German supervisors monitoring production quotas and worker behavior with obsessive attention to detail. Conversations between workers were forbidden during working hours. Lunch breaks were conducted in silence under the watchful eyes of guards who documented any interaction that lasted longer than necessary. Klaus found his own freedom equally restricted under Richter's new regime. Officers were required to file hourly reports on their activities, accounting for every minute of their duty shifts. Patrol assignments were generated randomly each morning and changed without warning throughout the day. Any deviation from assigned routes, any unexplained delay in completing objectives, resulted in immediate interrogation about the officer's motivations and reliability. The systematic dismantling of their communication methods felt like watching a beautiful garden being destroyed by methodical vandalism. Every bench where Alina might have sat, every corner where Klaus might have paused, every routine that had allowed their paths to cross was now monitored or forbidden. The geography of their love had been mapped and eliminated with military precision. Yet something remarkable began to happen during these darkest weeks of their separation. Alina discovered that her memory of Klaus had become so detailed, so complete, that she could imagine his responses to situations with startling accuracy. When she witnessed injustices during her daily routine, she found herself thinking about how Klaus would have handled the same circumstances, drawing comfort from her understanding of his moral compass, even when he wasn't present to demonstrate it. Klaus experienced a similar phenomenon, finding that his knowledge of Alina's character had become so intimate that he could predict her reactions to changing circumstances with uncanny precision. During staff meetings where Richter outlined increasingly harsh measures against civilians, Klaus would think about Alina's likely response, using his understanding of her courage and intelligence as a guide for his own behavior. Their love had evolved beyond physical presence into something that existed entirely in the realm of understanding and imagination. The forced separation that was intended to destroy their connection had instead refined it into its purest form, stripping away everything except the essential recognition of shared values and complementary souls. But this psychological intimacy came at a terrible cost. Alina began experiencing dreams so vivid that she would wake believing Klaus had been in her room, only to face the devastating reality of his absence. The line between memory and imagination became increasingly blurred as she constructed elaborate fantasies about conversations they might have had, walks they might have taken, futures they might have shared under different circumstances. Klaus found himself composing letters to Alina that he would never send, pouring his thoughts onto paper during the quiet hours before dawn, when the demands of military duty temporarily lifted. These phantom communications became a form of prayer, a way of maintaining his connection to the man he had been before the war, while acknowledging the man he was becoming through his love for her. The crisis that would change everything began with a simple mistake that demonstrated how precarious their situation had always been. During a routine patrol, Klaus encountered an elderly villager who had collapsed from exhaustion while carrying heavy supplies. Without thinking, Klaus helped the man to his feet and offered him water from his own canteen, an act of human kindness that would have been unremarkable in peacetime. The gesture was witnessed by Sergeant Mueller, an ambitious junior officer who had been watching Klaus's behavior with growing suspicion. Mueller had noticed subtle irregularities in Klaus's conduct over recent weeks, small deviations from perfect military protocol that suggested emotional involvement with civilian welfare. The incident with the elderly villager provided the evidence Mueller needed to file a formal report questioning Klaus's loyalty and effectiveness. Alina learned about Klaus's precarious situation through the network of whispered information that circulated among the village's civilian population, despite all attempts to suppress it. Workers in the German administrative offices occasionally overheard conversations that revealed the political currents flowing beneath the surface of military operations. The news that Klaus was under investigation sent Alina into a spiral of fear and desperate calculation. She understood that Klaus's willingness to help civilians, the same moral courage that had first attracted her to him, had now become the weapon that his enemies would use to destroy him. The irony was devastating. The qualities that made him worthy of love were the same qualities that made him vulnerable to those who saw compassion as weakness and humanity as a liability. Alina's response to this crisis revealed the extent to which their silent relationship had transformed her from a passive survivor into someone capable of extraordinary courage. Unable to communicate with Klaus directly, unable to warn him or offer comfort, she made a decision that would have seemed impossible for the frightened young woman who had first encountered him in the village square months earlier. She decided to create a distraction that would shift attention away from Klaus's activities by providing investigators with a more compelling target for their suspicions. The plan she developed was both brilliant and terrifyingly dangerous, requiring her to use her intimate knowledge of village routines and German security procedures to orchestrate events that would appear random, but were actually carefully calculated. Alina began leaving her apartment at irregular times, varying her routes in patterns that would eventually be noticed by the surveillance teams that monitored civilian movement. She started carrying packages that contained nothing suspicious, but were wrapped and handled in ways that suggested concealed contraband. Most daringly, she began positioning herself in locations where she would be observed by German patrols, but always in contexts that could be explained by legitimate civilian business. The effect was exactly what Alina had hoped for. Within days, surveillance reports began focusing on her activities rather than Klaus's behavior. Intelligence analysts became convinced that they had identified a potential resistance operative, whose movements suggested coordination with outside forces. The investigation that had been building around Klaus was quietly transferred to other officers, while resources were redirected toward Alina's apparent espionage activities. Klaus realized what Alina was doing with a mixture of admiration and horror that left him feeling physically sick. Her sacrifice was perfect in its execution and devastating in its implications. By drawing suspicion onto herself, she had saved his career and possibly his life, but she had also placed herself in mortal danger from investigators who would show no mercy if they believed she was working with resistance forces. The investigation that followed was conducted with the thoroughness that German intelligence brought to all suspected security threats. Alina's apartment was searched again, this time by specialists trained in detecting hidden communications and concealed materials. Her daily routines were analyzed for patterns that might reveal coordination with outside agents. Her background was investigated with meticulous attention to any detail that might suggest disloyalty or subversive tendencies. Alina endured weeks of interrogation that tested every aspect of her mental and emotional strength. Richter himself conducted several sessions, using psychological techniques designed to break down resistance and extract confessions from even the most disciplined subjects. But Alina's months of silent communication with Klaus had taught her skills that proved invaluable during these confrontations. She had learned to control her facial expressions completely, to reveal nothing through involuntary gestures or changes in breathing. The discipline required to maintain their wordless relationship had prepared her for interactions where any betraying sign could mean death. Her ability to think clearly under pressure, developed through countless moments when discovery would have destroyed them both, served her well during interrogations designed to create confusion and panic. Klaus watched Alina's ordeal from a distance that felt like torture, knowing that she was suffering to protect him while being unable to offer any assistance without exposing them both to even greater danger. His admiration for her courage was matched only by his anguish at his own helplessness, his inability to shield her from consequences that she had accepted on his behalf. The resolution of Alina's case came through circumstances that neither she nor Klaus could have predicted. A genuine resistance cell was discovered operating in a neighboring village, providing investigators with real targets for their suspicions and evidence of actual subversive activities. The dramatic arrests and discoveries that followed made Alina's minor irregularities seem insignificant by comparison. Alina was released from investigation with warnings about maintaining proper civilian behavior, but without formal charges or punishment. The experience had changed her in fundamental ways, stripping away her last illusions about the nature of the world she lived in, while confirming her understanding of what love could demand from those brave enough to embrace it fully. Klaus felt profound relief at Alina's survival, but also a new weight of responsibility that would influence every decision he made in the months to come. Alina had proven her love through actions that transcended anything he had imagined possible, and he understood that such devotion created obligations that went far beyond personal happiness or individual survival. Their relationship had survived its greatest test, but the experience had revealed truths about themselves and their circumstances that would reshape their understanding of what their future might hold. They had learned that their love was strong enough to inspire ultimate sacrifice, but they had also learned that the world they lived in would continue to demand such sacrifices as long as the war continued. Winter deepened around the village, bringing with it a quiet that felt different from the peaceful silence of their early relationship. This new silence carried weight and meaning that spoke of survival rather than discovery, of endurance rather than joy, of love that had been tested by fire, and emerged both stronger and more fragile than either had understood it could be. Alina and Klaus had proven that their connection could survive separation, suspicion, and the threat of death itself. But they had also learned that such survival came at costs that would mark them forever, changing not just their relationship, but their understanding of what it meant to love someone when the world itself had become their enemy. The hardest test was yet to come, and both of them sensed it approaching with the inevitability of spring following winter, of consequences following choices, of endings following beginnings that had demanded more courage than either had known they possessed. The winter months passed with excruciating slowness, each day bringing fresh challenges that tested the resilience Alina and Klaus had built through their shared ordeal. The village settled into a rhythm of oppression that felt both suffocating and strangely predictable, as if the entire community had learned to breathe in shorter, more careful intervals. Alina returned to her work at the seamstress shop with a composure that surprised even herself. The interrogations had left marks that went deeper than physical exhaustion, but they had also revealed reserves of strength she hadn't known existed within her. The other women who worked alongside her whispered among themselves about her experience, some viewing her with suspicion, others with a grudging respect that came from understanding how few people emerged from German investigation unbroken. The fabric that passed through Alina's hands each day became a kind of meditation, the repetitive motions of cutting and stitching providing a refuge for thoughts too dangerous to express aloud. But even in this enforced routine, she found ways to honor the connection that had sustained her through her darkest hours. When working with blue thread, she would think of Klaus's eyes. When handling wool that reminded her of his winter coat, she would allow herself brief moments of memory that felt like stolen prayers. Klaus had been reassigned to different duties following the investigation, a lateral move that Richter presented as routine rotation, but which everyone understood as a subtle punishment for the suspicions that had surrounded his conduct. His new responsibilities involved coordinating supply convoys between villages, work that required him to travel extensively throughout the region, and left little time for the careful observation of civilian life that had once allowed his relationship with Alina to flourish. The irony was not lost on Klaus that his punishment had become a form of liberation. The roads between villages offered solitude that was impossible to find within the confines of military headquarters, and the long hours of travel provided opportunities for reflection that had been absent from his previous routine. During these journeys, Klaus found himself composing elaborate mental letters to Alina, constructing conversations they might have shared, imagining responses she might have offered to the landscapes and experiences that filled his days. But the separation also brought new forms of torment that tested his emotional equilibrium, in ways that proximity to Alina never had. Without the daily confirmation of her presence, without the subtle reassurances that their wordless communication had provided, Klaus found himself questioning whether their connection had been as profound as he remembered or simply a product of wartime desperation and enforced isolation. These doubts became particularly acute during the long evening hours when Klaus found himself alone in temporary quarters that changed with each assignment. The poetry book Alina had given him remained his most treasured possession, but its familiar verses now carried undertones of loss that made reading them an exercise in controlled grief rather than shared joy. He began to wonder whether Alina thought of him with the same intensity, or whether her survival had required her to forget what they had shared in order to focus on the demands of each new day. Alina was experiencing her own version of this psychological struggle, finding that the absence of Klaus's presence had created a void that seemed to expand rather than diminish with time. The village square where they had first encountered each other became a place she avoided, unable to bear the memories it contained without the possibility of creating new ones. The fountain where she had left his book now seemed like a monument to something that belonged to the past rather than a symbol of ongoing connection. Yet something remarkable began to emerge from this period of enforced separation and emotional uncertainty. Both Alina and Klaus discovered that their love had taken root so deeply within their consciousness that it had become part of their fundamental identity rather than simply an external relationship. The qualities that had drawn them to each other, the values they shared, the understanding they had developed, had become integrated into their individual characters in ways that made separation painful but not destructive. Alina found herself making choices throughout her daily routine based on principles that she had learned from observing Klaus's moral courage. When faced with opportunities to report other villagers for minor infractions that might earn her favor with German authorities, she declined not because of abstract ethical considerations, but because she knew such actions would betray the person Klaus had seen in her. His respect had become a mirror in which she could see her better self, and that reflection guided her behavior even when he wasn't present to witness it. Klaus experienced a parallel transformation, discovering that his love for Alina had clarified his understanding of what kind of man he wanted to be regardless of the circumstances that surrounded him. The courage she had demonstrated during her interrogation became a standard against which he measured his own responses to difficult situations. Her willingness to sacrifice herself for his protection had shown him what real strength looked like, and that knowledge influenced every decision he made during his travels through occupied territory. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it changes that neither Alina nor Klaus had anticipated. Intelligence reports suggested that Allied forces were planning major operations that would shift the focus of German military activity away from routine occupation duties toward more active defensive preparations. Villages throughout the region were being evaluated for their strategic importance, with some designated as critical defensive positions, while others were classified as expendable assets that could be abandoned if military necessity required it. Alina's village fell into the second category, a designation that brought both relief and new anxieties to the civilian population. Relief, because it suggested that the oppressive security measures of recent months might be relaxed as German forces concentrated their attention elsewhere. Anxiety, because expendable assets had a way of becoming casualties when military situations deteriorated beyond control. Klaus learned about these developments through official briefings that outlined new deployment schedules for officers throughout the region. His convoy coordination duties were being expanded to include evacuation planning, work that would require him to assess transportation capabilities and identify potential refugee routes should civilian populations need to be relocated on short notice. The assignment brought Klaus back to Alina's village for the first time in months, ostensibly to evaluate the road network and transportation infrastructure that would be needed for potential evacuation operations. But as his convoy approached the familiar streets where their relationship had first developed, Klaus felt his carefully maintained emotional equilibrium beginning to crack under the pressure of proximity to everything he had been forced to leave behind. Alina learned of Klaus's return through the same informal communication networks that had informed her of his previous troubles. The knowledge that he was somewhere within the village boundaries, breathing the same air, walking the same streets, created a form of anticipation that was almost unbearable in its intensity. She found herself unable to concentrate on even the simplest tasks, her attention constantly drawn to windows and doorways in hopes of catching a glimpse of the man who had occupied her thoughts for so many months. Their first encounter after the long separation happened entirely by accident, a collision of circumstances that neither had planned but both had unconsciously hoped for. Alina was returning from the market when she turned a corner and found herself face to face with Klaus, who was examining a road junction that featured prominently in his evacuation planning assessment. The moment of recognition hit both of them with physical force that was almost overwhelming. Months of separation, uncertainty, and carefully controlled emotion suddenly compressed into a single instant of eye contact that contained everything they had been unable to say to each other during their long silence. Alina felt her knees weaken as she saw Klaus's face again, noting changes that spoke of the same kind of internal struggle she had been experiencing. Klaus felt the world shift around him as Alina appeared in his field of vision like an answer to prayers he hadn't realized he was still offering. She looked thinner than he remembered, marked by experiences that had aged her in ways that went beyond simple physical appearance. But her eyes still held the intelligence and courage that had first attracted him, and the sight of her face brought back memories so vivid they felt like physical sensations. Neither spoke, of course. The presence of other German soldiers conducting their own assessments made any form of communication impossible. But the look that passed between them carried months of accumulated longing, worry, and relief, compressed into a few seconds of recognition that felt more intimate than any conversation they might have shared. Alina continued walking past Klaus with the same measured pace she had maintained since learning to navigate life under occupation, but her peripheral vision captured every detail of his appearance, cataloging changes and similarities with the desperate attention of someone who understood this might be their only opportunity for such observation. Klaus remained focused on his official duties, but his awareness of Alina's presence was so complete that he could sense her movement through the village streets long after she had disappeared from view. The psychological impact of this brief reunion was profound for both of them. Alina felt as if a missing piece of herself had been temporarily restored, confirming that their connection had survived the months of separation and doubt. The reality of Klaus's presence, even experienced so briefly, validated the memories and feelings she had been nurturing during their time apart. Klaus found himself energized by the confirmation that Alina was not only alive and well, but that the impact of seeing her had been as powerful as his memories had suggested it would be. The doubts that had plagued him during the long months of separation evaporated in the face of actual encounter, replaced by a certainty that what they had shared was real and enduring regardless of the circumstances that kept them apart. But the reunion also brought new challenges that neither had fully anticipated. Alina realized that seeing Klaus again had awakened longings that she had learned to suppress during their separation, creating a hunger for connection that would be even more difficult to bear now that she knew he was nearby. The knowledge that he was somewhere within walking distance made his absence feel more acute rather than less painful. Klaus discovered that proximity without the possibility of communication was a special kind of torture that tested his self-control in ways that complete separation never had. Knowing that Alina was going about her daily routine just streets away from his temporary headquarters created a constant distraction that made focusing on his official duties increasingly difficult. The situation was further complicated by the military realities that had brought Klaus back to the village. His evacuation planning assessment revealed infrastructure weaknesses that suggested civilian populations might indeed need to be relocated if military conditions deteriorated. The possibility that Alina might be forced to leave the village, that their brief reunion might be followed by a separation that could become permanent, added urgency to their situation that made their inability to communicate feel even more frustrating. Alina sensed the undercurrents of change that were flowing through the village as German military activities intensified. Conversations among civilian workers carried hints about potential relocations and strategic withdrawals that suggested their community's future was far from secure. The possibility that she might be separated from Klaus by forces beyond their control, that their story might end not through choice, but through the random movements of military necessity, created a desperation that influenced her thinking in ways she was only beginning to understand. As Klaus's official assessment period drew toward its conclusion, both he and Alina found themselves facing decisions that would determine whether their love story would continue to unfold, or whether it would remain forever suspended in the realm of memory and possibility. The time for passive acceptance of circumstances beyond their control was ending, and the moment for active choice was approaching with the inevitability of dawn following the longest night either had ever experienced. Klaus's assessment period was scheduled to conclude on a Thursday, and by Tuesday evening, both he and Alina understood that their window of opportunity was measured in hours rather than days or weeks. The official reports Klaus had filed painted a stark picture of the village's strategic limitations, recommendations that would likely result in reduced German presence and possible civilian evacuation within the coming months. Alina had spent sleepless nights weighing possibilities that seemed to offer only variations of loss. If Klaus departed with his convoy and normal military rotations resumed, their brief reunion would become nothing more than a painful reminder of what remained forever out of reach. If evacuation orders came through, she would be relocated to some distant processing center, where finding Klaus again would be virtually impossible. Every scenario she could imagine led to endings that felt like slow death. Klaus faced his own impossible calculations as he prepared his final reports and recommendations. His official duties required him to suggest that the village's civilian population be relocated to areas with better transportation infrastructure and more defensible positions. But implementing such recommendations would scatter Alina and the other villagers across occupied territory in ways that would make any future contact impossible to arrange or predict. The solution that occurred to both of them emerged not from careful planning, but from the desperate clarity that comes when all conventional options have been exhausted. Alina realized that Klaus's evacuation planning had inadvertently provided her with detailed knowledge of transportation routes and relocation procedures that could be used for purposes far different from those intended by German military planners. Klaus understood that his position as convoy coordinator gave him temporary access to vehicle assignments and travel authorizations that could potentially be redirected without immediate detection by his superiors. The window for such action would be extraordinarily narrow, the risks almost impossible to calculate, but the alternative was accepting permanent separation from the person who had become the center of his emotional universe. Alina and Klaus made their choice on that final Wednesday night, choosing love over safety, hope over certainty, each other over the world that had tried to keep them apart. Their silent love story became proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, when hatred seemed to consume entire nations, the human heart could still recognize itself in another. They discovered that the most powerful words are sometimes the ones never spoken, that the deepest connections can flourish in spaces between breaths, between glances, between heartbeats that somehow learn to synchronize across enemy lines. Their courage reminds us that love doesn't conquer war, but it survives it, and sometimes survival is the greatest victory of all.